James had always considered himself a reasonable man, the kind who followed rules, paid taxes on time, and generally tried to be a good neighbor. After 15 years of corporate grind as an electrical engineer, he finally saved enough to buy his dream property. 2 acres of beautiful land in the prestigious Whispering Pines development. It came with a private pond, a small wooded area at the back, and the promise of tranquility, albeit under the watchful eye of a strict homeowners association, HOA. The listing agent assured him the HOA's rules were standard, designed only to maintain property values. James reviewed the covenant, found nothing objectionable, and signed on the dotted line. For the first year, everything was idyllic. He built his custom home, landscaped meticulously, and even installed discrete solar panels that the HOA approved after he demonstrated they wouldn't be visible from the street. Life seemed perfect. Then, everything changed when Elaine Cartwright became the new HOA president. Elaine, new to the community, had campaigned aggressively, promising to elevate Whispering Pines into the county's premier development. At her first meeting as president, she unveiled her Community Enhancement Initiative. The HOA, she announced, would reclaim underutilized portions of private properties for communal use, walking trails, picnic areas, and a community garden. James's stomach dropped when he saw his property highlighted on her presentation map. Nearly half an acre around his pond was marked for Phase 1 of the plan. "I'm sorry," James said during the Q&A session, "but that's my private property you're designating as communal land. I never agreed to this." Elaine gave him a condescending smile. "Actually, James, if you'll check Section 12, subsection D of the covenant, the HOA reserves the right to designate limited common areas for community enhancement, with appropriate compensation to affected homeowners." James was stunned. He'd read the covenant thoroughly and didn't recall such a provision. "What exactly would appropriate compensation entail?" he asked. "The board is proposing a 10% reduction in your annual dues," Elaine replied smoothly, "which is more than fair, considering the minimal impact and the benefit to your property value from this community improvement." "Minimal impact?" James shot back. "You're talking about strangers having access to my backyard and my pond. That's a significant privacy and security issue." Elaine's smile tightened. The area would be accessible only to Whispering Pines residents during daylight hours, and we'd install appropriate signage to ensure visitors respect boundaries. Several other homeowners nodded approvingly, seemingly entranced by Elaine's vision. James looked around for allies but found few. Only a couple of others whose land had been marked seemed concerned, though they remained silent. "I need to consult my attorney about this," James said finally. "Of course," Elaine replied with manufactured graciousness. "We'll proceed with preliminary planning in the meantime. Full implementation is scheduled for next month's meeting." That night, James sat down with the covenant, already dialing his real estate attorney. To his dismay, the provision did exist, buried in dense legal jargon and cross-referenced with other sections in a way that made its full implications nearly impossible for a non-lawyer to comprehend. His attorney, Marcus, confirmed it. "This is unusually broad authority for an HOA," Marcus admitted, "but they do have to provide reasonable compensation. A 10% discount on your dues is laughable for what they're proposing. However, the covenant specifies that any modifications must comply with local zoning laws, safety regulations, and property ordinances. That gives us room to maneuver." Over the next 3 weeks, James researched frantically while observing disturbing developments. Small flags appeared along the proposed path through his property. A surveyor showed up one morning without notice, claiming the HOA had authorized him to mark boundaries. James politely but firmly asked him to leave. Then came an official-looking letter detailing the Community Nature Area Implementation Schedule, which included dates for fence removal, path installation, and bench placement, all starting just 2 weeks after the upcoming vote. The breaking point came when James arrived home to find Elaine herself in his backyard with 2 other board members, gesturing toward his pond and discussing plans for a dock. "What are you doing here?" James demanded, his voice tight with anger. "You're trespassing on private property. All of you need to leave immediately." "There's no need for hostility," Elaine replied, her tone suggesting James was being unreasonable. "As HOA board members, we have inspection rights for community planning purposes. Show me in the covenant where it says you can enter my property without notice or permission," James countered. "Unless you can produce that documentation right now, you're trespassing, and I'll call the sheriff." The other board members looked uncomfortable, but Elaine merely sighed as though dealing with a difficult child. "We'll schedule a proper inspection with notice then. But this uncooperative attitude isn't helping anyone, James. The community enhancements will proceed regardless." That night, James barely slept. The audacity, the entitlement of these people to simply decide his private property was now communal land was infuriating. But anger wouldn't solve this. He needed to be strategic. The next morning, he called Marcus with a new plan. "I want to install a security fence around my property," he said. "Something that complies with HOA rules but makes their community nature area impossible." Marcus was silent for a moment. "The covenant does allow for security fencing, but with board approval. They'd likely deny your application under the circumstances. There's something else they can't easily block, though. Agricultural designation." "Agricultural? My property isn't a farm." "It doesn't need to be," Marcus explained. "State law has protections for agricultural land use that supersede most HOA restrictions. If you maintain even a small area for agricultural purposes, say a few beehives or some livestock, you gain certain rights, including appropriate fencing to protect your agricultural investment." This was the loophole James needed. Over the next week, he submitted paperwork to register part of his property for agricultural use. He ordered 2 beehives and arranged for them to be delivered and set up by a local apiarist. He also purchased 4 pygmy goats from a nearby farm, small, gentle creatures that technically qualified as livestock without requiring extensive care. With his agricultural credentials in order, James contacted a specialty fencing company. They understood exactly what he needed: a perfectly legal electric fence designed for livestock containment. Not the high-voltage kind that would seriously harm someone, but with enough juice to deliver a memorable shock to anyone who ignored the warning signs. The fence installation began 3 days before the HOA vote. It was a substantial investment, nearly $20,000 for the specialized equipment, professional installation, and premium materials, but protecting his property was worth every penny. The fence enclosed the entirety of his agricultural area, which conveniently included the pond and wooded section the HOA had targeted. Bright yellow warning signs were posted every 15 feet. Caution: electric fence, agricultural protection area, no trespassing. The reaction was immediate. Within hours of the installation crew setting up, James's doorbell rang. Elaine stood on his porch, flanked by 2 other board members, her face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, skipping pleasantries. "You've installed an electric fence without HOA approval. This is a direct violation." James smiled pleasantly and handed her a folder containing copies of all his documentation. "Actually, I've registered part of my property for agricultural use. State law permits appropriate security measures to protect livestock and agricultural investments. You'll find all the relevant legal citations and permits in here." Elaine flipped through the papers with increasing agitation. Bees? Goats? This is clearly a deliberate attempt to circumvent the Community Enhancement Initiative. I've discovered a passion for sustainable living, James replied with mock earnestness. The honey and goat cheese will be wonderful additions to my lifestyle. And, of course, I need to protect my investments from predators, both animal and human. Her eyes narrowed at the implication. This fence is dangerous and violates our community aesthetic standards. The board will not approve this. The board doesn't have the authority to disapprove it, James countered. Agricultural use has specific protections under state law that supersede HOA regulations. The fence meets all safety standards and is properly marked with warnings. Anyone who ignores those warnings and trespasses does so at their own risk. We'll see about that, Elaine snapped, storming back to her waiting compatriots. The legal committee will review this immediately. Please do, James called after her, and while they're at it, have them review trespassing laws as well. The next morning brought another surprise. A cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney demanding James remove the fence immediately. Marcus reviewed it and laughed. They're bluffing. They know the agricultural exemption is solid. This is just intimidation. They responded with their own letter detailing the legal basis for the fence, the properly registered agricultural status, and a counter-warning about HOA interference with legally protected agricultural activities. For good measure, they added a Freedom to Farm Act citation and appended references to the substantial penalties for trying to prevent legitimate agricultural operations. The scheduled HOA vote was awkward, to say the least. When Elaine unveiled the updated community enhancement map, James's property had been conspicuously removed from Phase 1. She made no mention of the change, but the tension in the room was palpable. During the open comment period, James raised his hand. When acknowledged reluctantly by Elaine, he stood to address the assembly. I'd like to invite all interested residents to a beekeeping demonstration next Saturday at my property, he announced. The agricultural advisor will explain the environmental benefits of honeybees and proper safety around hives. Children are welcome with adult supervision. Please, just use the front gate. The agricultural security fence is for your protection. The look on Elaine's face was worth every cent James had spent on the fence. Several homeowners actually seemed genuinely interested in the beekeeping demonstration, asking questions and noting the time in their phones. What James couldn't have anticipated was the ripple effect his stand would create. Within days, 3 other homeowners whose properties had been marked for community enhancement contacted him privately, asking about the agricultural designation process. One was already considering raising chickens, and another had always wanted to try growing specialty crops. The community began to divide, not dramatically, but noticeably. Many residents remained indifferent, but a vocal group supported Elaine's vision of communal spaces, while another contingent became increasingly concerned about property rights and HOA overreach. The first incident with the fence happened about 2 weeks later. James's security cameras caught 2 board members approaching the fence line, apparently testing whether it was actually electrified by touching it with a stick. When nothing happened, one of them reached out to touch the wire directly, and quickly discovered that the fence was indeed fully functional. The shock wasn't dangerous, but it was certainly effective. He jumped back with a yelp that was clearly audible on the recording. The second incident was more concerning. James returned home to find Elaine and a man in a municipal uniform examining his electrical box. When confronted, she claimed they were investigating reports of code violations related to the electric fence. The man turned out to be a city electrical inspector who had been misled about the purpose of the visit. Elaine had reported a potentially dangerous electrical installation without specifying it was a properly permitted agricultural fence. After James showed him the permits and installation documentation, the inspector confirmed everything was up to code and left. Elaine remained defiant. "This is not over, James. That fence is a hazard and an eyesore. The board has a responsibility to protect the community. The fence is legal, properly marked, and serves a legitimate purpose." James responded calmly. "If anyone from the HOA tampers with it, disables it, or trespasses past it again, I'll press charges and file for an injunction. Try me." She departed with a huff, but James immediately contacted Marcus to document the incident. They sent another stern letter to the HOA board, warning against further harassment or misrepresentation to municipal officials. The beekeeping demonstration was surprisingly well attended. About 20 neighbors showed up, genuinely interested in the process. The apiarist was excellent, explaining the environmental benefits of honeybees and proper safety around hives. Even a few children attended with their parents, fascinated by the beekeeper's protective gear and the glimpse into the hives. Throughout the demonstration, James noticed Elaine parked down the street, watching from her car but never approaching. It was petty vindication, but vindication nonetheless. Over the next few months, an interesting transformation occurred. 2 other properties in Whispering Pines erected agricultural fences after establishing their own small agricultural operations. The HOA board became increasingly divided on the Community Enhancement Initiative, with several members questioning the legal and practical implications of attempting to repurpose private property. The tension came to a head at the quarterly meeting 3 months later. Attendance was unusually high, with many homeowners curious about the ongoing conflict. When Elaine attempted to introduce Phase 2 of the initiative, targeting different properties now that the original targets had protected themselves, a board member James had rarely heard speak raised her hand. "Before we proceed, I move that we reevaluate the legal basis for designating private property as communal land," she said firmly. "Several homeowners have expressed valid concerns, and our legal expenses have increased significantly due to conflicts over this issue." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Another board member seconded the motion. Elaine looked like she'd swallowed something sour. "This initiative is crucial for enhancing our community profile," she insisted. "Every premier development has communal amenities." "Then perhaps we should focus on actual community property," suggested another homeowner. "The HOA owns that 3-acre parcel at the entrance that's just sitting empty except for the sign. Why not develop that instead of trying to take pieces of our private property?" The suggestion gained immediate traction. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to temporarily suspend the Community Enhancement Initiative and form a committee to explore alternatives using existing common areas. Elaine's influence waned rapidly after that. She remained HOA president until her term ended 6 months later, but wasn't re-elected. The new president, a retired judge named Harold, took a much more measured approach to community improvement, focusing on enhancing genuinely common areas and respecting private property boundaries. As for James, he discovered he actually enjoyed his small agricultural pursuits. The honey from his beehives was exceptional, and the pygmy goats became beloved pets that kept the grass trim in their enclosure. He maintained the electric fence. It had served its purpose in protecting his property rights, but now it genuinely protected his agricultural investments as well. Elaine eventually sold her house and moved away, reportedly to a development with a more progressive approach to community planning. Harold made a point of revising the HOA covenant to clarify and limit the limited common areas provision, requiring explicit owner consent and fair market compensation for any private property used for communal purposes. The irony wasn't lost on James. Elaine's aggressive overreach had ultimately led to stronger property protections for everyone in Whispering Pines. Sometimes it takes an electric fence to shock people into recognizing boundaries, both literal and figurative. During the following spring's community picnic, held on the newly landscaped actual common area near the entrance, Harold approached James with a glass of lemonade. "You know," Harold said quietly. Your stand against Elaine's land grab was the catalyst for some important changes around here. That agricultural exemption was clever. James smiled. Just protecting what's mine while trying to be a good neighbor. Sometimes those goals align perfectly. Indeed they do, Harold agreed. By the way, my wife was wondering if you might have any of that honey available for purchase. She says it's the best she's ever tasted. No purchase necessary, James laughed. Good neighbors get it for free. I'll drop some by tomorrow. As he looked around at the community gathering, people chatting amicably, children playing, everyone enjoying the properly designated common area, James felt a profound satisfaction. His electrified fence still hummed quietly around his property, a constant reminder that sometimes the best way to be part of a community is to first establish clear boundaries. As for Elaine Cartwright and her Community Enhancement Initiative, well, sometimes the best revenge is simply protecting what's yours and watching justice unfold naturally, with just enough electrical current to make the point stick.